It is such a pleasure to be able to talk to you in any context, at any opportunity. Welcome back to Bad Faith Podcast.
Well, it's always a blessing for me. And ooh, what a force for good and constancy and consistency you have been over time and space. I'm telling you.
It's so generous of you to say that, because I got to say, people who listen to the show know that I often, I doubt that. I second guess, and I wonder if I'm pushing in the right directions, if the kind of projects that I take on are ultimately useful. And, there's this whole a kind of a national conversation that's emerged about the kinds of topics that we've been talking about on Bad Faith for a while, with respect to how to consider, how to frame folks in movements that are not ideologically aligned with our own, in fact, which are often harmful to our own. And Joe Biden, I'm sure you're aware, recently gave this speech, characterizing, parts of the country as MAGA Republicans and using the word fascist. And there's been a whole dialogue going on about whether or not it's accurate. And even if it's accurate, whether it's appropriate, whether conservatives who are objecting to this are hypocritical because they too have characterized Democrats as fascist. If everyone's running around calling each other fascists, what's the point of even having the terminology fascist? And I wonder if you've been following any of this and what you make of whether or not there should be a certain level of discretion used when referring to our kind of political enemies, political opponents, political others, because of the broader, longer term goal of coalition building. Should we be thinking about that?
Well, one is a matter of just trying to tell the truth, and truth has its own kinds of precisions, but every precision still has a certain vagueness on the edge. So that authoritarian populism is different than conservatism. Conservatism is different than fascism. Neo-fascism is not the same as outright fascism. In the 80s, we had long discussions about friendly fascism. I've been using the term neo-fascist ever since Trump emerged. And so, I just deal with the consequences. Why? Because for me, neo-fascist is the rule of big money and big military with white supremacy as the public face that goes hand in hand with the transphobia, homophobia, hatred of immigrants, usually a degrading of Jews. And with Trump, I could already see that combination. Now, this is, before he won. Now, then when he wins, it becomes very clear we do get the rule of big military, big money, white supremacy, the public face, explicitly hating, when I say immigrants, I'm mainly talking about immigrants from Mexico and Haiti. And so I've continually been using neo-fascism across the board, but many supporters of the neo-fascists like Trump are conservative. There's no doubt about that. They're supporting a neo-fascist, but they're conservative. They themselves are not fascists. Some are authoritarian populists, not outright fascists, because populists have a deep suspicion of big money. They got a deep suspicion of elites on Wall Street and so forth, like George Wallace and company. He was a white supremacist, xenophobic, authoritarian populist who hated Wall Street, who was very critical of the corporate elites, very critical of big money. And so so we want some kind of a truth-telling tied to a certain kind of precision, but it's clear that every word and term is going to have its misuses and abuses. There's just no doubt about that. But there's no doubt that we're living in one of the most dangerous moments. Now, there I resonate with Brother Biden, because when he talked about threats to democracy, you and I have been talking about that for a long, long, long time. And even when I wrote Democracy Matters in 2004, I was using similar kind of language and got in a lot of trouble. And now 18 years later, the free market fundamentalism, when I was talking about the authoritarian rule and the militarism abroad and the white supremacy internally and the male supremacy internal, which I was trying to lay out almost 20 years ago, becomes even more and more visible and manifest in that way. So I don't back away from the neo-fascism. If the president wants to use it, Biden has made his contributions toward a certain neo-fascism because,
For sure.
absolutely, the crime against humanity in terms of invasion and occupation of Iraq, the crime against humanity of mass incarceration, the unbelievable attack on poor and working people with the bailing out of Wall Street that he supported with Obama. All these made their contributions to a context in which neo-fascism begins to emerge and escalate. And Trump becomes a major agent of it, but it's not just Trump, there's a whole host of others as well.
So I think that's such an important point to make, because I do think that part of the objection that some people are making, and there are people across the political spectrum who take issue not with, I think, so much Biden's characterization of Trump himself as a fascist, but of half the country, some percentage of voters and regular sort of people. And, Bernie said this once at some point, I think in 2018-ish. He was asked whether he thought Trump voters were racist. And he said, I prefer to talk about Trump and not categorize voters that way. Hillary Clinton's comment about basket of deplorables was, criticized by people even outside of the right, because it seemed to be a kind of essentialist understanding of a large swath of the population, which she was going to have authority over, a large degree of control over as president of the United States. And is that the kind of tone, even if true, even if you believe it to be true, a leader should take over the people that are so vulnerable in the society? So that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is, is it a useful distinction if we're in a place where I'll put it this way. If Biden has also made his contributions to fascism for the reasons that you just articulated, then is it accurate to critique his speech as being political because he is calling other people fascists, not because of an objection to fascism, which he has contributed to, but because it is always useful to point out the failures of your political opponents? Whether or not it's accurate, right, of course, is a separate question, which I think we all agree that all of them are fascist. But what work is that term doing when Biden is deploying it in this way? Is it being deployed in a way that basically erases his own contributions, as you put it, to the problems that we're dealing with today?
Yeah, but see, one can be a contributor to neo-fascism or a facilitator of it without being a fascist oneself.
What's the distinction in your eyes?
A distinction in mind. Let's look in the case of Brother Biden, that he certainly created and helped create a mass incarceration system that had fascist elements to it, that he applauded and that he praised. But at the same time, he doesn't call for, the elimination of his political enemies. He doesn't call for his political enemies being enemies of the state. He's targeting a very vulnerable slice of the population, disproportionately Black and brown, who are themselves headed toward mass incarceration. The same would be true for various supporters of Trump. You see, I don't think that the vast majority of supporters of Brother Trump are fascists, not at all. Trump is a fascist, yes. Why? Because he is the most visible person to provide an alternative, a fascist alternative to a decaying neoliberal order. And we on the left were unable to convince enough people that our alternative was desirable. That's why you got some people who voted for Brother Bernie. Some people voted for Trump. Why? Because they knew that the neoliberal order was decaying, could not deliver, had not delivered, and their hatred of the dominant tendencies of and dominant figures of the professional managerial class cut so deep. Now that's populist right there, you see. It's just deep. It's New York Times, it's Washington Post, it's CNN. That's what you get on Fox News. That's what you get in a variety of right-wing folk. Because the professional managerial class has so delegitimated itself with its arrogance and its greed that folk had to find some alternative. And that's exactly how fascism emerges in many democratic experiments. When the neoliberal version can no longer sustain its legitimacy, And the left-wing alternative, which we tried to provide with Bernie, right, couldn't pull it off. You see, it could, so that you can see, you see how we have to be, I think, very subtle in this regard. See, Biden is not a fascist. He is the major figure, he and Obama, of trying to legitimate the neoliberal order. And he's holding on for dear life. But they had 8 years. You see, he's holding on for dear life. Now, what happens is, once it becomes just fascism versus anti-fascism, then even Biden becomes part of an anti-fascist coalition, even as he facilitated the mass incarceration and facilitated the crime against humanity in Iraq.
Well, what does that look like for Biden to be part of an anti-fascist coalition? Because there are some people who would say your description of how neoliberals offering an inauthentic alternative is meaningfully part of the problem, and that one shouldn't try to disentangle them from part of the rise in fascism, because arguably without them, without the neoliberal broad left standing in the way of, let's say, the Bernie style candidate, then there would be a legitimate outlet to a lot of the populace further, the discontent with the social order, all of these other kinds of things. And that they played a co-equal role, even if the way that they go about it is perhaps more polished, less openly targeting of people. I mean, when you say, Biden has never tried to, I forget the words used, but vanquish his enemies, as it were.
Enemies of the state.
It made them enemies of the state. Well, you could say having an incarcerated population that's disproportionately Black and brown, where more Black people are in jail now than existed under slavery, and many of them are disenfranchised as a consequence of either being in jail or by laws that disenfranchise them even after they're out. It's hard for me to see, it's a strong argument that is, in fact, making folks enemies of the state, literally disenfranchising them and locking them up, at least as much as what someone like Donald Trump has done. Well, I mean, what would you say to that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Let's go back to COINTELPRO under the Kennedys, vis-a-vis Martin and Malcolm, Black Panther Party, Fannie Lou Hamer, Nation of Islam, those groups that were targeted under J. Edgar Hoover. Mm-hmm. Now, that was a neo-fascist attack, not just on a slice of a population, but on a movement. That's a little different, because that's where you really get political enemy. See, because it's one thing to have drug laws and mediating of attacks on poor people when these poor people are not themselves involved in organized efforts to bring power and pressure to bear on the nation state. See, to target the Black Panthers is one thing, because that's an organized group of persons. That's the Alfred Woodfoxes and Herman and Russell and Mark Teemer and all of those magnificently courageous, Mumia Abu-Jamal and others. See, that's one thing. But when once you, so that if we look, so we say to ourselves, well, does that make Kennedy fascist? Does that make Johnson fascist? And I would say, well, there are fascist elements in their attack on their political enemies. But they're still liberals when it comes to how they want to engage in civil rights acts and legislation. They're still liberals in terms of a certain regulation of the corporate elites, but not too effective, but not freewheeling in a way in which the Goldwater and the legacy of the Goldwater rights would want to do.
That's fair, Professor West, but let's take, I would say, even though folks who are much more knowledgeable than I am as historians would, I'm sure, leverage their critiques of Kennedy, but even with the knowledge that I possess, I see some daylight between a Kennedy and a Biden, to the extent that you're saying that there's at least a basic support for these civil rights interests and, willingness to go to the bat for a certain degree of social safety net. I know that a lot of the rhetoric from the contemporary Democratic Party purports to still believe in those kinds of things. Right. But when you look at, as people like David Sirota have done so well and in such detail, the ways that they exploit kind of procedural mechanisms to always have cover for never actually affecting any of those policies, you can see a world in which you can get away with a lot of lip service while doing absolutely nothing. And also it's unimpeachable. No one can prove that you're any different than Kennedy. You can just say, oh, well, I just had a different Congress than Kennedy had. I had different movement and political structure, and I wasn't able to accomplish as much. And it's not actually clear to me. I'm not making such a bold claim, I think, as to say, Joe Biden absolutely does not want to pass H.R. 1. Joe Biden absolutely does not want to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. But Joe Biden absolutely does not want to cancel all student debt. But I think evidence is mounting, especially when you look at these executive order style things like student debt cancellation, that he doesn't want to do it. He could and won't deschedule marijuana and let all of those people that he locked up with his drug policies out of jail. And at what point, if you're standing there holding the trigger, holding the button that could release all those people, undo all of those years of neo-fascism, and you don't, at one point, there's this historical tradition of Democrats managing to get away with more and do more harm, Bill Clinton and welfare, quote unquote, reform, than Republicans could ever dream of, because they are able to cloak it in the veneer of respectability.
No, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, Biden's refusal to really want to fight for voting rights. So he says, well, okay, these folk over here are a threat to democracy. We have been saying for the last 15 months that a major threat to democracy is the fact that we have no mechanisms in place that would ensure even bourgeois rights, even the right to vote for mainstream candidates.
Right.
And he refuses to fight for that, but he gives speeches about it.
Right.
But it's a very low priority. And once, of course, Supreme Court speaks, and once, of course, the crisis escalates, which is going to do in November, and even more so 2 years from now. And you say, look, you're talking about all these threats to democracy. You had a chance to intervene. You didn't do it.
Right.
How substantive, how serious are you in terms of your attempt to preserve democracy and all the pretty words that you are trotting out in terms of your commitment to it? But then, we know with the Kennedys, they were very reluctant to promote voting rights because it's a political issue. Most of these folk are Machiavellian politicians rather than principled statespersons. There's no doubt about that. So they're just looking to see, what to do relative to which votes to get and so forth. It's very much like even the corporate media these days. They figure, well, if we can make more money being like Fox, then let's move to the center. Let's move to the right. That's where the money is. Well, Trump, in many ways, was the Frankenstein-like figure who was created by corporate media, not just Fox, but CNN and MSNBC. They covered every speech, every period, every comma. And here we are with Brother Bernie. Bernie's got 20,000 people, and he got one little cameraman who's running into the wall and poles and so forth. Say, well, wait, where's the press? Where's the press? Well, he's not entertaining enough. Oh, so for you, American democracy is really about entertainment. Trump is entertaining. So go on and make your money and create this Frankenstein that will come back to haunt you. And lo and behold, you got a neo-fascist challenge to your own democracy as you made all this money. Corporate media, they don't want to be accountable in that way either, you see. And it's a sad thing in terms of just how short-sighted and myopic, tied to greed, the professional managerial class can be and the corporate elites can be. That's where the populists are, in some sense, right, even when they're right-wing populists. The hypocrisy of the liberal professional managerial class.
So I'm so glad you've landed on that point, because that was the animating question that caused me to reach out to you a couple of weeks ago to schedule this conversation, because we were in the midst of a media cycle, or at least a Twitter cycle, about whether or not the left should take the opportunity of conservatives criticizing the FBI as an institution because they are trying to deflect from Trump's investigation, to make our own critiques of the FBI as an institution that has historically, disproportionately, and overwhelmingly attacked the left and left movements.
Absolutely.
And use it as an opportunity to actually say yes and propose our own legislation that would reform the FBI in meaningful ways that would either abolish it or make it so that it's actually accountable more often for people like Donald Trump, to the extent that he's broken the law here, and less often to people like the African socialist activist who was raided in July. And I wonder what you make of that. Do you think that this was an opportunity to push for FBI reform or abolishment, or do you think, like some people said, that it is dangerous to agree even rhetorically with someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, even in a limited fashion?
I mean, one is that, again, you just try to tell the truth. I believe the truth is always bigger than any ideology. It's always bigger than any political perspective. And there's no doubt that the FBI, as a repressive apparatus of a U.S. nation state rooted in deep white supremacist perceptions and practices, has been not just negative, but a force for evil when it comes to the Black freedom movement. Anytime you're going to treat Brother Martin in that way, you're not going to be a force for good. Anytime you treat Malcolm and Fannie Lou like that, well, you're not a force for good. Now, you're human beings. You know, as a Christian, I'm not going to demonize you, but you're not a force for good at all. Now, I gave you an example. During the Man March, where a number of us had death threats and were told we wouldn't live, X, Y, and Z. And the FBI then reaches out to me and says that we've infiltrated all of these white supremacist militia groups and your names are on the thing and we want to let you know. And I'm thinking, well, I appreciate that. You still a repressive apparatus. You still are very much my foe in terms of the what you've done to my people and my freedom fighters and so forth. But I appreciate that because you've infiltrated those groups that are trying to kill me. So they're reaching out. I'm a citizen. They want to let me know. I said, oh, okay. And in direct discussion, we talked about that quite explicitly. See? Quite explicitly, because they're the only ones who've infiltrated those groups. And so they letting folk know. Well, you know, that's probably about 4 or 5% of the things that you have done that I know of.
Right.
That in no way counter and in no way outbalance the ugly things that you've done and continue to do. So again, it's just a matter of trying to tell the truth about it. So when you get neo-fascists or you get right-wing folk talking about, well, the FBI has gone beyond their scope. FBI has been going beyond their scope, going all the way back to the Palmer raids.
Right.
Even before they were the FBI. But J. Edgar Hoover was there when they rooted all the socialists out and shut down the socialist newspapers and so forth and so on, right? That goes all the way through Paul Robeson, Du Bois, and Victoria Garvin and what have you, you see. And so it's interesting to me, though, how, you know, the right wing could talk about those of us who are concerned about transferring significant amounts of funds to social programs as opposed to militaristic responses to what's happening on the street in Black communities. And they say, well, defund the police. It has to be some communist thing. And now they're talking about defunding and abolishing the FBI, the same people who were critical just a few years ago. He said, oh, I see. When it comes to your house, in your neighborhood, all of a sudden, the language shifts and the perceptions are qualitatively different. But you know what? Black folk on this side of town are just as precious as your right-wing Trump folk who are now targeted by FBI, targeted now by the repressive apparatus facilitated by the Justice Department. Now, I do believe in fairness across the board. I think even right-wing fellow citizens ought to be treated fairly. You see, because I'm not a fascist with a left sensibility. Right. I don't believe in just having political enemies and just doing away with them, and throwing them in jail, or having mock trials and so forth. See, I don't believe in that. I wasn't raised and reared like that. See, I would fight for Trump and others to have a fair trial. Would Trump fight for left to have a fair trial? No way on the guy's heaven.
But is that the bar? Is that the bar by which we define ourselves? You know, we'll only be as good as Trump would be to us. I mean, yeah, quite plainly not.
That's right. That's not the way to live. That's not.
And what you're describing sounds a lot like I saw some people in response to a recent episode asking me to make more strongly the distinction between a kind of authoritarian left and a more libertarian left. And I think part of the divisions that have been happening among the left are those who are very guarded against certain authoritarian tendencies, whether in a speech context, whether it has to do with some of the ways that mandates have been, vaccine mandates and mask mandates have been enforced in ways that don't necessarily accord with what the ideal medical situation would be, not really designed well to have the maximum effect at the same time that other interventions have been largely ignored by the public, like HVAC systems and things like that. And on and on and on, even if they themselves are very enthusiastic about masking and vaccinating and things like that. What does it mean when you start to give the state permission to do these kinds of things that are also not seemingly guided by reason or science in the way that you would like? Looking at the legacy of authorization of military force and all of the extension of the state power that came after 9/11, I think people are rightly guarded about that. But there's others who, whose leftist principles guide them in a different direction, and which causes them to say, I'm looking out for the interests of immunocompromised people and vulnerabilized people and differently abled people and folks who can't negotiate the COVID landscape in the same way. And, free speech is obviously so important, but what about the ways that, trans people on the internet are being targeted and how that's manifesting in real instances of violence in real life? And how do you balance those interests? These are conversations happening within the left. And I think they're harder because, they're leftists in the typical rejoinders of, oh, you just hate trans people, or you just are a Trumper who doesn't care about science. They fall a little bit flat, and it's difficult to have these conversations. I wonder if you've given that any thought and how you negotiate those two kind of halves of our political space.
Yeah, see, for me, prophetic witness is not reducible to particular political positions. And prophetic witness is being part of movements and solidaristic efforts and alliances where you work with people who you don't always agree with. See, so that as a person who tries to be part of a prophetic tradition, I've always worked with leftists who I had many disagreements with. Many of them were authoritarian. I just tell them that. You know what I mean? I got my dear brothers and sisters in the Revolutionary Communist Party with Ovechkin and Carl Dix and Susara and Andy. I love those brothers and sisters. We fight like cats and dogs. And I'm just using one example. But we come together and we go to jail together. But same would be true in terms of other left-wing formations. Even the Black Panther Party that I never joined, you see, because they had a certain animus against Jesus, loving free Black men like myself. I understand. So I just work in your programs and things because I love what you're doing for poor people, right? But I knew that there was a certain authoritarian perception toward Christians and Buddhists and religious folk because they were secular. They got a right to be secular. So I go to streets with them. I go to jail with them. But if there's any authoritarian elements or other elements, I'm critical of it because I'm bearing my own prophetic orientation. And so they know that, you see. And in DSA, we had our struggles inside. Barbara Ehrenreich, Michael Harrington, Stanley Aronowitz. We had political committee, Joseph Swartz. We go on for hours and hours. Some of us were more Gramscian, like Mary Marable. Others were Bernsteinian and more social democrats. Others were almost really close to the Democratic Party and all other ways. Those are all tendencies within the DSA, going back to March 1982. So when I joined that, I knew I was going to be very, very critical of certain elements. And you could imagine, the Million Man March with Nation of Islam. I got into so much trouble with Minister Louis Farrakhan. Oh, West, you supporting Black fascism, with patriarchy, homophobia, and so forth. And I tell the minister, but you know where I stand on feminism, womanism, my gay and lesbian sisters, trans, and so forth, democratic socialism. But we're going to come together, Million Man March. How come? Because we love the brothers who are catching hell, going to jail, and therefore we'll have a variety of voices. He will call it. Ben Chavez will be there. I'll be there. Haki Mahabuti will be there. Maulana Karanga will be there. Sonia Sanchez will be there. Maya Angelou will be there. Look at this cacophony of voices, but it's called by Minister Louis Farrakhan. And at that point, I mean, that's where, all hell broke loose. And I'm saying, and look, y'all, my prophetic witness has always been one that's not reducible to either the leadership or the organization. It is a presence in these contexts, these movements, these efforts to try to highlight a group of highly vulnerable yet precious people. And therefore, you end up thoroughly misunderstood, you can imagine.
Yeah, look, I very much can't imagine. I don't have to use much imagination, in fact, because I mean, what's so I think remarkable about you, Dr. West, is that there are several things coming together at once. One is your longevity in this space and the fact that you have such credibility because of the substance of the work that you've been doing for so many years and the relationships that you've built with people. I think that a certain benefit of the doubt is extended to you by many, not all people. We all know that there's some people, maybe named Barack Obama, who might still have a little chip of their shoulder about you. But broadly, even people who disagree with you really respect you because they see you as the ultimate good faith actor. And you also have this, there's something about your manner and the way that you address people with so much respect and warmth. And, the use of these kinds of, honorifics, brother and sister. And it does generate a sense of genuine warmth and camaraderie. And I think it makes people more willing and open to hear you and to not characterize you as the worst of the association that you've been tagged with, However, I think, most of us, at least now, at my kind of new age in this space, don't have those kind of credibility markers. And we're often in situations where, the fact of me agreeing with someone, let's say like Jimmy Dore, about something like force the vote means that I'm guilty by association, even though we came together over an issue that I think was really important. Or the fact of Jimmy Dore, having a Boogaloo Boy on his show and talking about the ways that whatever Boogaloo Boy is, I'm not entirely sure still, but there was apparently some untoward element of their belief system, but they were willing to walk with Black Lives Matter protesters and agree about some anti-criminal justice stuff,
Sure.
Where do you draw the line? Is it just that, you have the credibility to be able to move through some of these spaces and do events with Louis Farrakhan and not be tied with some of the critiques, or permanently tagged at least and stained with those associations? Is it just about your personal credibility? Or is there something about the decision making you're doing about how to decide who is appropriate to coalition build with and who is maybe beyond the pale? Do you think there's a such thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you've got a number of those characteristics yourself, my sister, in your own very, unique way.
Very generous.
Different generation. No, it's true. It's true, because I think it has a lot to do with being jazz-like and being flexible and fluid, but still having your own voice. I mean, that's Mary Lou Williams, that's Lester Young, right? That they're able to move back and forth, they're able to shift, adopt, but at the same time that people know who they are, they know who they are, they know there's always a line in the sand, as it were. But the line in the sand is one that has to do with a moral and a spiritual criteria. It's not a one of being just pure or pristine. You see, if I'm spending time with Minister Louis Farrakhan because I love his willingness to live and die for Black people, and at the same time have a strong critique of any kind of devaluing of Jewish brothers and sisters, intolerance of it, consistency. When they're in trouble, you just go there, right? If it be a student in school, it could be a movement or whatever it is, because that's just a matter of principle. So they say, oh, okay, well, if we think Minister Louis Farrakhan is anti-Jewish, well, Brother West is with him, but he's also in solidarity with his Jewish brothers and sisters catching hell. What is going on? We don't understand it. No, follow through on it. And then we can have debates about, whether he really said it was wickedly great, or whether he's great in wickedness. And, that goes on and on and on, because a lot of times he just misunderstood on that. But he needs pushing like anybody else on a whole host of different issues. But the same would be true in the Bernie Sanders campaign, as you know, with Black activists.
Yeah.
Somebody like Jimmy Dore, I tell folk up front, the brother is my brother. And when he speaks the truth, the critiques of neoliberalism, I'm with him. When I think he's wrong, I try to tell the brother when he's wrong. And I mean, running for president, Let the brother go on and do his thing and run. If he runs, well, are you going to be in his corner? Well, I got a long way to go before I even think about what's happening in the next election. But
yeah. Do you have a long way to go, Dr. West? Because people are talking about it already, and people are
yeah,
questioning whether Biden's going to run at all, and if he does, is if there's going to, or either way, rather, whether or not the left should start preparing to get behind a singular left candidate, so that the divisions that have existed in the post-Bernie world don't damn any eventual
right,
left candidate.
right. There's just so much more that's going to happen. The unpredictable events, the turn, pivotal shifts that are going to take place. And the market culture is so fickle. It's just like you mentioned George Floyd, right?
Mm-hmm.
2 years ago, racial justice, murdering black people by the police, number one issue. Today is probably about 13.
Yeah.
You see, it just things flip just so quickly. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So I think the important thing is that we just want to be clear as to what we stand for politically, ideologically, morally, spiritually, regardless of who the candidates are, regardless of what the circumstances are. Now, in the end, you're going to have to make some practical judgments, as always. That's all. You have to make practical judgments. But these days, it's just hard enough just to keep sanity, dignity, some dose of integrity together, given the neo-fascist despair that's being spread everywhere you look.
Well, to that point, I think I would be remiss not to bring up the ongoing water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi, it's I think it's either the poorest or the second poorest state in the nation, depending, I think, on the year and the stats, with West Virginia. It is the blackest state in the union. It is a city that is, I believe, about 85% black, and one that experienced a lot of white flight, and where the white legislature does not direct funds to these densely populated urban areas, despite there being a tax base there. It's a city that has been clamoring for infrastructural support and developments for a very long time. And it's a state that used to be the wealthiest state in the Union because of the legacy of slavery and how many plantations were headquarters there. It is a state that has always loomed large in my mind for those reasons, and also because the demographics of the state, always struck me as making it a real opportunity for a Democratic Party that lived up to its stated ideals. If it were really a Democratic Party that valued Black people, that was trying to win congressional seats so that it could defeat Manchin and Sinema, who are allegedly the ones that are stopping everything, Biden's agenda, if you believe that, as opposed to a rotating villain theory. It's a state where there were for example, in 2018, two open Senate seats, and the Democratic Party invested very little in trying to win them, despite the fact that you only need 15% of the white population to win in Mississippi. And now we're seeing in this moment what seems like a confluence of everything that we've known about the state and the racial dynamics and class dynamics of the state emerging in this crisis. On the backdrop of this crisis is billions of dollars being sent to Ukraine, a president who won largely on the backs of Black voters and Black turnouts, and won the Senate because of Black voters and Black turnout in Georgia. And while there are, of course, platitudes and nice statements made in a state of emergency called, which is important, we are still living in a world where not only Flint has not had the investments it's needed to have clean water, and not just Jackson, but there's something like 3,000 similarly poisoned cities across the country. And it does seem to me, like, again, if we go back to this conversation we were having about what makes a fascist, it is telling the truth, and also telling the truth about what inaction and not just what action is resulting in these kinds of crises.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. Because we keep in mind, when we say tell the truth, we're also trying to tell the truth about the suffering and the social misery. Anywhere, especially in places that have chronic histories of it, like Mississippi. Mississippi has been the ground zero for the struggle for Black dignity, going back to Delta and the Blues and Robert Johnson. You see, it's no accident that Mississippi has produced more great artists than any other state in the history of the American empire.
That's a big claim, Dr. West. But
Oh, it's true. Look, think of the novel with the Faulkner. Think of
mm,
the short story, Eudora Welty. Think of
mm,
plays with Tennessee Williams that's from Tennessee. Think of David Ruffin from Why Not Tennessee. Think of Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha's father. She's a genius. He was a kind of genius too. He's from Mississippi.
mm.
We can go on and on. Richard Wright, uh, Margaret Walker, not born there, but shaped there, right there in Jackson, right? I mean, it goes on and on and on. Mississippi, New York and Massachusetts, nowhere close to that cacophony of Mississippians, both vanilla as well as chocolate. But at the same time, precisely because it was ground zero for the Black freedom struggle, it has been targeted most intensely. That's why the precious Black folk in Mississippi, you hear it in David Banner's hip hop. You see it in Sister Ward's novels, even today, right? Renaissance taking place in Mississippi. Old brother Eddie Glaude did it up in Mississippi, right? Tavis Smiley, Mississippi. Voices coming out in their own distinctive ways, but the suffering on the ground. Chocolate City, 80-some%. Most of the water's undrinkable, brown and all the other colors. And where's the priorities of these milquetoast neoliberals like Biden and the Black Congressional Caucus and the Democratic Party? Hardly say a mumbling word about it because they don't want to make the party look bad given the elections that's coming. Please, we've got to somehow push suffering to the side while you engage in Machiavellian politics. And we know it's a low priority on your list, where it's a high priority in ours. And of course, we'd say the same thing about the bad water anywhere. It could be Flint. It could be white poor folk in Appalachia. It could be our precious Chicano brothers and sisters in Arizona, anywhere like that. You know what I mean? It's a moral and spiritual issue. Very much so. So I hear exactly what you're saying, but that's precisely why I just hope and pray that you never become too discouraged. There's nothing wrong with being despairing because you can't be a blues woman or a jazz woman without with despair. But despair don't have the last word, right? That's Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit. She knows she's singing about American terrorism and catastrophe, but it ain't having the last word. No, because you got to cut so radically against the grain. And as the grain becomes more indifferent and cold and callous and neo-fascist, the voices of light and truth-telling and warmth become more indispensable.
I hear that, and I very much agree. And I certainly am not so despairing that I feel at all like I'd flag in my efforts. In fact, it's almost like I don't know. We used to call them Chinese finger traps. That might not be apropos. I apologize, but the more you pull, the more tight it is. Like the worse it gets, the more committed I feel personally. Yeah. However, I wonder if you share this feeling that I feel, and many other people feel like it is bad in a way that feels increasingly insurmountable without a cosmic break. Between, I don't know if you've seen this conversation about Republicans trying for a constitutional convention, the way that these culture wars around issues concerning the ability of trans people to get treatment, medical services, the Boston Children's Hospitals got a bomb threat over this kind of stuff. It's animating Republican sweeps in all these school boards across the country. And increasingly, people who I think don't really identify as conservative historically are being animated to shift right because of these sorts of issues. The aforementioned speech issues, the way that COVID is motivating elections in a way that I don't feel like the Democratic Party has fully internalized yet. Some of this stuff feels so in the water, for lack of a better analogy, that it's difficult to know where to start. Oh, this $1.6 billion donation given to the group that is behind all of the right-wing Supreme Court picks and the Federalist Society and all of this. It's so deep, and they've been rigging the rules for so long. And in controlling the narrative in ways that I think the left and Democrats broadly just are reacting to. That it's overwhelming, and I wonder how you're feeling. Does this feel like at all a different moment to you, or is it just am I just too young to know how bad it can be?
No, you rightly characterized. Let me just read something from you. This is from Black Metropolis, written by the great Sinclair Drayton, Horace Caton. And this is how they end the text. Because now this is 1945, right? 1945, and they're talking about how do we move forward? He says, it's conceivable that the Negro question, given the moral flabbiness of America, is incapable of solution. Then he goes on to say, but we must realize this one world. Black folk have been the whipping boy for the emerging American fascism for a while. He said, what happens to one affects all. A blow strike for freedom in Bronzeville gives its echo in Paris, in Senegal. A victory for fascism in Midwest metropolis would sound the knell of doom for the common man everywhere. Now, of course, Richard Wright wrote the introduction to it, right? This is young Richard Wright. And what does he have to say? Richard Wright says quite explicitly, he says, let us be just very honest about this. He says, Richard Wright says it quite explicitly. He says, oh, will America, when she's brought face to face with the problem of the Negro, and he's talking about the class question, collapse in a moral spasm, as did Europe when confronted with the problem of the Jew. This is 1945. Now, this is at a time in which, Black folk probably got about 75% poverty. It's only about 4% of us going to college. Middle class is a lumping bourgeoisie so thick and thin and shallow that you go to Fisk with the paper bag tests and Howard and so forth. And yet here come these dignified Black folk. Some of them in the Communist Party, some of them socialists, some of them just progressive, some of them just loving Jesus, or loving Muhammad, or loving Buddha, but gonna fight to death. Right? 1945. Now here we go, 80 years later. Right, the whole planet's about to collapse. Fascism everywhere in Hungary and Brazil and different parts of Africa, increasing everywhere you look. And yet we still telling the truth, seeking justice, loving our neighbor, trying to be stylish, got a smile on our face, and remember our mamas and our daddies and our grandparents. You see, ooh, what a people. Not because we beyond anybody else, but because that's where we come from. That's what's going into the making of who we are as a blues people and a jazz people, you see. And does it mean then there's any guarantee? Not at all. Shoot, a comet may come and just knock out the whole planet, but we went down with style and a smile. Fascism may tell we went down with style and a smile. We might win. And if we win, we're going to have to keep the vigilance going because, as you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Going to need some more critics, going to need some more truth telling. And we pass it on to the next generation. That's exactly, for me, the good news in a very, very bad news global situation.
Well, look, Dr. West, I don't know how I could miss the opportunity to end on that beautiful and optimistic note, not bring you back down in the muck with me with a bunch of other pessimistic questions.
But I salute you and your parents and those who shaped you, my sister, because you are holding strong. You're holding
strong. I just want to say I value and appreciate you so much, Dr. West. The fact that you're in this space and that you have this ability to spiritually rally a community that has lost whatever kind of spirituality is useful, whether it's a kind of secular spirituality or a religious one. I do feel strongly that absence, that lack of community, that lack of ability to appeal to something other than the practicality of what works and what doesn't in strategy and political machinations is part of what's led to some of the factions that have emerged on the left in the broader sense of disaffectation and despair. Yeah. And so I just want to thank you both for doing what you do more broadly and for being so generous with your time on this podcast.
Oh, but thank you. You stay strong, and we in it together. We'll be faithful unto death. Faithful unto death.
Dr. West, do you have anything that you would like to point people to? Anything you've written recently? New books coming out? New podcasts? Anything like that?
No, not really. Not really.
I just want to give people an opportunity to find you.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's fine. I'll just make sure I'm going to put this on my social media, because these are the kind of conversations to talk to you is to engage in a high quality dialogue, and that's very, very rare in the culture these days.
Well, thank you so much. I can't think of any higher compliment. I will definitely make my mom listen to this at the top of her backlog of Bad Faith episodes. Thank you again, Dr. West. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.